I want to introduce this month's speaker, Sam Bock. I started hearing about Sam back in the days when I worked at OSMP from my boss, who showed me some write-ups that Sam did of some of the properties on OSMP. They were really great. And then we found about how much we're fans of Patty Whitcomb. So I was really excited when Sam accepted the job at History Colorado and started working on the Sand Creek Massacre exhibit. One, just to see the updated exhibit, but also to see what would become with tribal relationships. So I asked Sam to come talk to us. So for those of you that don't know Sam, he's History Colorado Publications Director and Managing Editor of the Colorado Magazine. He served as the lead exhibition developer for the Sand Creek Massacre, the betrayal that changed Cheyenne and Arapaho people forever. His graduate work at CU Boulder focused on the intersections of environmental and indigenous history in the American West. He is a fourth-generation Coloradan born and raised in Boulder. Sam, thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Main range of the camera. Wait, awesome. Well, hello. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. So glad to be here in the open space office, which is where I started my career. I was a junior ranger for 12 years, 12 consecutive summers, which I think is still the record. I'm not confirming that, I haven't asked, but pretty proud of that. And then I had to leave Boulder to go have a career in history. So I wound up at History Colorado through luck and good fortune, and my advisor, Patricia Limerick, was the Colorado State historian. And I've been there ever since, about 6 years now. This exhibition, well, actually, before I get started in that, maybe Christian can kind of relay from folks online, but I always like to start by maybe just like a show of kind of thumbs up to thumbs down. How familiar is everybody with what happened during the Sand Creek Massacre? Because this group, okay, great, people are really sort of mostly thumbs totally up. I will give the briefest breeze through. We're getting in a lot of thumbs down online. Okay, great. By the way, if there's any of my History Colorado colleagues, hi Holly, hi Becca. I'm here. Okay, so Sand Creek Massacre is the deadliest day in Colorado history. Over 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly elders, women, and children, were indiscriminately slaughtered on Big Sandy Creek in southeastern Colorado, near what is today the town of Eads. And the tribal representatives who we worked with for this exhibition, who I think we probably worked with in the past on Sand Creek issues, they felt very strongly that the word betrayal is the best way to characterize this. Because the people who were killed there were the bands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho who followed the leaders seeking peaceful relationships with the U.S. government. They were told to camp near Fort Lyon on Big Sandy Creek in order to receive protection and rations from the U.S. military. They were forced to give up their weapons. And like I said, this is mostly, it was a chief's camp. And these people were starving and relying on the United States government for rations. And so on the morning of December 29th, 1864, when the Cheyenne and Arapaho heard the hoofbeats of what turned out to be the cavalry on the way, they thought, oh, maybe this is bison. We can go and hunt a couple bison. Or maybe it's the cavalry coming to bring us our rations that we've been waiting for. Yeah. But instead, the soldiers opened fire. And that is really the least horrible part of the entire story. Because immediately in the aftermath, before some of the people were even finished dying, soldiers committed inexplicable acts of really depravity against the Cheyenne Arapaho, taking body parts as trophies. They were displayed later in the Denver theater as, in this gruesome victory parade and paraded around the streets of Denver. And the question is always, how could this happen? And the answer is unsatisfying, but I think, this betrayal that the Cheyenne and Arapaho people experienced and that they continue to experience. This is a generational trauma that is a very real, unhealed wound for many of the tribal representatives that we work with. it comes down to dehumanization, I think, is really the way to describe this. That is in so many wars, which, present example, in order to conduct these horrible things, one has to see your enemy as less than human. And as we know, that is a really common way Americans have understood, peoples, and honestly, many still understanding peoples today. So at History Colorado, we really believed that this was a very important story that is undertold. And a lot of that is because these tribes, because of the Sand Creek Massacre, were forced violently out of Colorado. They no longer have representation in the state. They no longer have any kind of political say. They often have been, marginalized, ignored, especially, the number. There is actually a pretty good number of Cheyenne and Arapaho in Denver. But, because of Sand Creek, they have not had the representation that they need. Our museum, well, we usually would start with a land acknowledgement in these kinds of activities. But I think the entire exhibit's talk is its own land acknowledgement, right? This is the story of how the land that we're standing on right now became our land and not their. The story of theft. And just as an exercise, and I usually do this with younger audiences, so if we want to keep moving, we don't have to, but if you've got your phone on you, like a really interesting thing to do is just to look up the driving distances and the driving times between these spots. And so if you want, I can just talk you through it. This, you don't have to pair up and do all that, but the driving time between Eads, Colorado, which is the closest town to the Sand Creek Massacre site, and our museum in Denver is about 3 hours. That's, in a modern car, 300 roughly miles. So several days to transit between the site and Denver at the time. But today, this is where these tribes are headquartered. The Northern Cheyenne in Lame Deer, Montana, the Northern Arapaho in Riverton, Wyoming, and the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho people in and around town of Concho, Oklahoma. This is a 2-day drive. This is about an 8-hour drive, and this is anywhere between 2 days and, well, many days, depending on how fast you drive and what the weather's like. And the reason I start with all of this, again, it's that land acknowledgement, but it's also just to say that the practical real world effects of the Sand Creek Massacre are literally written on the landscape, right? In terms of where these people live. And also, the archaeology, I'm a room full of archaeologists, so, get in the dirt, right? But the archaeology of the place that the massacre happened. I'm going to do now is give a little bit of background on our exhibit, the process behind it, and the partnerships that enabled it, rather than talking in depth about Sand Creek Massacre, because that's something we all know a lot about. But feel free to stop me. Feel free to ask questions. I'm, really just kind of free form up here. I was a former 8th grade teacher, so you're not going to throw me off my game. Even 14-year-olds can't do that anymore. So the story of the Sand Creek Massacre exhibit at History Colorado begins 10, 11 years ago now, with the opening of the new building in Denver. Used to be sort of where the RTD Park and Ride is, and then we moved down the street, and in 2012 got a brand new beautiful building where we are now. It's probably the nicest state offices of any agency in Colorado, which, I mean, I still sit at a cubicle, so don't be too jealous. But as part of opening that museum, folks at the time really recognized the Sand Creek Massacre as being probably the most significant and also least known event in Colorado history. And, that's for a number of reasons. First of all, the whitewashing of history and the intentional obfuscation of this terrible traumatic past that, led to us being here today. And also partly because of the lack of political representation for Cheyenne and Arapaho people. But I think mostly it's the severe unpleasantness and traumatic nature of the story. There's no heroes, there's no savior, there's no silver lining. It's just tragedy after inexplicable tragedy. And so when the new, we good? Oh, wow, look at me.
How's that happening?
When the new exhibit was going to open, we have a gallery on the second floor. If you're familiar with History Colorado, it's called Colorado Stories. It was meant to be sort of a vignette overview exhibit of significant moments in Colorado's past. And the Sand Creek Massacre was going to be, one of the stories told in that gallery. And the team really did a lot of work and research to present this exhibition in the way that they knew how, which was to say from a pretty standard white Western, albeit sympathetic, understanding of the Sand Creek Massacre. They called it Collision. That was the title of the first panel when you walked in, and it wasn't really the title of the exhibition. And I think that was the first indication that something was researched, because it really presented sort of a neutral point of view. These are two groups of people that collided into each other, and this was the tragedy that resulted. And the reason that exhibit, from our perspective 10 years on, got it so wrong was that they did not consult with the tribal representatives in a deep enough way. They had a conversation about some of the stories that needed to be shared. Do I need to pause? Are we good? Folks online, did I mess something up by playing the video?
I don't know
I don't
why
know.
it's showing that window.
Well, that's
Do you mind
probably-
minimizing?
It just needs to be.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
Okay.
So there was a consultation, and they had consulted on this information before with tribal representatives as part of a dog soldiers exhibition at the old building. And at the time, the staff creating the Sand Creek Massacre exhibition History Colorado thought, this has been consulted, it has the buy-in of the tribes, and we're just going to go ahead and open this up. It's going to be great. People are going to learn about Sand Creek. What could be bad? Well, it turns out that it's not enough to just have one consultation, especially when it comes to Sand Creek. And so our tribal representatives, the same ones that we worked with 10 years later, who were gracious enough to come back and give us another chance, they first politely asked for changes to be made to the exhibition, and they were refused. Then they asked for the exhibit to be closed, and they were refused. And so they really had no choice but to go to the media and to go to the governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper, and really force the leadership of History Colorado to close this down, take it down, and start all over. And that's what happened between 2012 and 2013. 2014, there was renewed consultation with the Cheyenne and Arapaho representatives, and it resulted in a memorandum of agreement between, sovereign tribal entities and the state of Colorado. This is a government-to-government relationship that is mandated by federal and state law. We, as a state agency, cannot reach out to, Joe Schmo, I'm Arapaho, and call that consultation. We go to the tribal government and we say, we would like to do X, Y, and Z, and we would like consultation. Can you please appoint a representative to work with us? And they were very kind, and they said yes. We appointed the same people you worked with last time, and the process of restoring trust between History Colorado and these representatives is ongoing, to be frank. And for a lot of reasons, most of which has to do with this terrible precedent, but also hundreds of years of betrayal. They have zero reason to trust our organization other than they know me and they know my colleagues who worked on this exhibit, and they know this process that we're talking through. So in 2017, efforts to revamp and redo the Sand Creek Massacre exhibition accelerated. Shannon Worrell, who was our director of exhibits planning, really spent a lot of time driving across the country to start reassembling these relationships. She brought tribal representatives to History Colorado to have a comprehensive collections review. Every item in our collection, which is hundreds of items that was attributed to a Cheyenne or Arapaho person, was reviewed, was evaluated for these people, for the representatives to say, yes, that is a Cheyenne arrowhead, or it's a Cheyenne pattern, or I recognize it as Cheyenne, or no, I don't know what the heck that is, but it sure isn't Cheyenne or Arapaho. Go ask the Comanche. And so we learned a lot from that, and that was sort of the genesis of, okay, here's some of the things we can use for this exhibition. During that time, between 2017 and 2020, we were supporting a number of initiatives with the tribes, including the Sand Creek Massacre spiritual healing room, which clips of for a long time there before COVID, since 1999. It was a relay run from the Sand Creek Massacre site in Denver, and it culminated in speeches and dignitaries on the steps of the Colorado State Capitol. Followed by a feast at History Colorado, catered by Tukabi, which we haven't been. It's really good. And that was really, honestly, most of our involvement with the Sand Creek commemoration efforts. All the while, the National Park Service had been working with these same descendants groups and representatives to create the Sand Creek. Which, until very recently was little more than a gate and some property and one interpretive building. And that was it. And then there was this run, and that was really all there was about Sand Creek. And so when we started this project, what are you doing at work? They expect me to start talking about beer, because that was my last thing. I'm a beer historian as well as historian of tragedies. And when I told them I was working on an exhibit about the Sand Creek Massacre, universally they said, "Is that what I think it is?" And I said, "Yeah, but so much worse." And it just speaks to the total lack of knowledge about Sand Creek among the general population of Colorado. And I think it speaks to, again, the overwhelming tragedy and sadness of the event, and the fact that there's no silver lining, there's no way to teach about it that says, yes, this was horrible, but. So work began on the revamped History Colorado project in January 2020, which was great timing. I'll tell you what, we had one consultation online before COVID, and then everything locked down. And many of the representatives we were working with are elders. Many of them have responsibilities in the tribe, caring for elders, and somehow, through sheer grit and determination, grace and kindness, these representatives agreed to continue meeting with us on Zoom. And, really, at first it was contentious. It was a lot of, you stink, you don't know anything, here's what you got to know, and, you really messed up. And that was what we heard mostly during these consultations for the better part of a few months. Actually, the better part of a year. In spring 2021, we were fortunate enough to receive 2 grants that totaled over $650,000. One from National Endowment for the Humanities, the other from Institute for Museum and Library Services. And I would say that was the turning point in the relationship, and the turning point in, our thinking that, okay, yeah, this is actually going to happen. And what the representatives told us at the time was, we really weren't sure you were serious, and we really weren't sure you were going to do this. We weren't sure you were going to listen to us, but the money shows commitment. You went out of your way to go get this money. You can bring us down. It's going to fund things that are important to us. We want to work with you. And from there, I wouldn't say things were smooth sailing, but they certainly opened up. We were fortunate to have that money because it enabled us not just to bring the tribal representatives to Colorado, but also to go to their communities and eat where they eat and see their homes and see their teepees, help them put up the teepees for whatever they wanted to do. We got to go pet some of the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes bison, which was scary and great. Um, Incidentally, we're standing, I mean, from me to you, a fully grown male bison.
Don't get the fuzzy couch.
Well, the tame one, they had one baby who had been sort of orphaned. So that one was fine to pet through the fence. But the full male bison, being that close, I mean, you can imagine, seeing Ralphie run, that was as close as I've ever been to a bison. But, all the guys who are in charge of the herd are out there totally nonchalant. And we're like hanging onto the truck, kind of trying to jump in. They're like, no, as long as they can hear the click of the feeder driving around, you're fine. But if that thing runs out of feed, yeah, you might want to hop in the truck. Oh, great, thanks a lot, guys. And here we are in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. So yeah, that was harrowing. We learned a lot from those trips, not just about how to handle bison. I'd say one of the biggest lessons was that, of course, shouldn't have been a lesson, but sometimes you just gotta learn. Tribal communities, Cheyenne and Arapaho communities do not speak with one voice. There is a wide range of opinions on everything, just like in every community around the world. But particularly when it comes to the Sand Creek Massacre, it's divisive. And because we were used to working with the descendants of the victims and people who were very open about the Sand Creek Massacre, whose mission was to raise awareness. We've been accustomed to thinking, this is just, I can't believe people don't know about this, and everyone has to know. Why wouldn't you want people to know? We walked into what they call the Northern Arapaho Experience Room, the Wind River Casino, in near Riverton, Wyoming, which if you get a chance to go to Riverton, don't. But it's a really beautiful place in Northern Arapaho. We're so generous and welcoming. And in fact, that's where this picture is taken. This is my colleague, Glennis, who was so very recently was our NAGPRA liaison and consultation coordinator, but she left for greener pastures in California. Well, more money in California. And she's working with Ben Ridgely, who some of you might know. He's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer tribe and also a descendant of the massacre victims. Anyway, we're up there and we go into the Arapaho Experience Room to see the elk hide, the famous Ridgely family elk hide. It's a painting of the Sand Creek Massacre based on the oral histories that have been passed down in his family for generations. And if you've seen anything about the Sand Creek Massacre, odds are you've seen this hide. It's stunning. And a photograph and reproduction of it is on display at the District Colorado Center in the exhibit. Anyway, I keep getting sidetracked. The guy in the Northern Arapaho Experience Room, we told him what we were there for, and he said, don't talk about Sand Creek. That's cursed. Not like he's joking, like this is a real curse. Bad things will happen to you and your family and this project if you continue working with it. That was news to us, and so far that has not happened, but knocking on wood. But again, it was a lesson. Not everybody agrees. This is not something that everyone is comfortable talking about. And not everyone agrees that it should be talked about. It's for some people it's too painful. For other people, yeah, tribe's got to move on. It happened and it's terrible, but it's history. For other people, it is living daily trauma. One of our representatives shared with me that he was at his niece's birthday party. She's 35 years old. Watching her run around, playing with her friends. Birthday party, and they're having a great time, and all of a sudden, he starts thinking, well, there's a lot of kids this age at Sand Creek, and a lot of them probably killed there. And if that's not generational trauma bubbling up and continuing to leave lasting scars, I don't know what possibly could be. So that's just to illustrate a few of the contradictory messages we were getting from the tribal representatives, and also to demonstrate the complexity of this topic in these communities, not just here in Colorado, but everywhere. Well, in spite of the curse, we kept plugging along, and we held 2 in-person consultations here in Colorado, one at the History Colorado Center, where we mocked up the entire exhibit in paper, printed out pictures of artifacts that we could possibly use. I wrote way too many words that were totally wrong about Sand Creek, just as a place to start. And we hung them on walls as mock-ups of what things could be. lined out the floor plan and taped off a 3,000 square foot area, which is the site of the exhibit gallery. And with pen and paper, the tribal representatives, we all walked around and took notes on what was wrong, and it turned out it was most of it. Later that year, we met down at the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, where I learned to put up a TV, and it's just as terrible and hard as you think it is. And it's not terrible, it's interesting, but it's tricky, and especially if you've never done it. And it gave me a whole new respect for Cheyenne and Arapaho women who in the past were tasked with this job and who undoubtedly commanded a lot of help from their family, put up these gigantic teepees. In September 2022, we had our final consultation with the Cheyenne and Arapaho representatives. And by that point, we had consulted on every detail of this exhibition. We had daily phone calls with many of the representatives. Each one of the people on our 5-person team, text messages, emails, phone calls, 2 or 3 times a day. Every element of the exhibition, every period, every comma, every artifact, every image, the paint color of the walls. I think I'm kidding, but I'm not. Paint color of the walls in the exhibition. These are all topics of consultation. And this is not me saying, how great is this, that we had this awesome process. This is just to illustrate the contrast between the approach that was taken in 2012 when it was museum staff leading the project, and 10 years later when museum staff realized that this can't happen unless tribal representatives are leading this process. And we were fortunate that the representatives were willing to share their knowledge, but that they also wanted us to use our expertise as exhibit developers and curators and historians to create this exhibition and to tell the story in the best way that we know how, in the way that's going to tell it to the people of Colorado who are mostly going to be this exhibition. So we got final approval to open up the exhibition a few weeks beforehand, in late October, and we decided with tribal input that the exhibition needed to open to the Cheyenne and Arapaho communities first. So on November 18th, I don't know if you remember, it was 4 degrees and blizzarding. We had tribal elders and youth and folks drive from all 3 of these communities. We closed down the museum and we opened the exhibit and our entire museum to just the tribal representatives, or just the tribal folks who had come down, who'd been specifically invited. And it was just really, really, really great because there weren't dignitaries giving speeches. It was families together learning, seeing things. And it was really powerful for them because our representatives knew what would be meaningful to their communities. And they created this exhibition to be meaningful and to be real for those folks. It does not cater to white audiences. It does not cater to people who don't know anything about Sand Creek, even though it explains this in full. And it's not even about the Sand Creek Massacre entirely. In fact, 2/3 of the exhibition is about Cheyenne and Arapaho cultures, not just some for the massacre, but also their communities today and their efforts both to commemorate, like with the tribal, with the spiritual healing run, but also what's going on for them, and that's different. As you'll see if you ever come to the exhibition, that's different for all 3 communities. For the Northern Arapaho, what's going on in their world is sports. It is basketball, football. Football is life on that reservation. For the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, it's the bison herd. They're really proud that this pilot program where they are creating, their own bison processing, sort of hoof to packaging. They're creating it all themselves, and it's already bringing down diabetes rates on the reservation, or well, in their towns, because the Southern Sheriff's reservation was terminated. For the Northern Cheyenne, it is hope and despair in, frankly, equal measures. Meth, unemployment, every rural problem is magnified for the Northern Cheyenne, and this is true, broadly for all the tribal representatives. And of course, I don't speak for these tribes at all. I'm relating what I've heard from them. This is not my story. But you know, for them, it's also hope, right? There is a sense that the culture is still strong, the language is still important, and there's a lot of effort to keep these things going and to share with the next generation. And I can't tell you how many times you're in the middle of a consultation, they're like, I gotta run, I've gotta go teach a language class to like 14, 10-year-olds online. By the way, from, you know, they're in northern Montana and they're teaching this class to kids in Oklahoma and all across, kids in Denver, Cheyenne kids. So, you know, we create an opportunity for them to just bring the artifacts of contemporary life to the public here in Denver to show we're still here. We're modern people, but we maintain our traditions, we maintain our culture. It's still strong. And that was the message at the end of the day that they wanted to send. And that was, I think, beyond the fact that it wasn't consulted, right? The fact that the first exhibit wasn't adequately consulted resulted in the fact the original exhibition being way too focused on just the massacre and on this collision, as they called it. Whereas that's not the only thing. The Sand Creek Massacre is not defined Cheyenne and Arapaho. They are modern people. They have thermostats, right? They put up TVs, but in the cold term. So we really hope that that's the message that comes through in this exhibition. Two separate tribes, two separate histories, two separate cultures united by this one tragic day. These are some of the folks we're really grateful to. Some of these names are probably really familiar. Gail Ridgely, Ben Ridgely, Otto Braided here in particular have been working on Sand Creek issues since, well, probably before I was born, but at least since the 1990s in Colorado. They were deeply involved with the founding of the historic site, and they continue working with us today. In fact, Otto called me earlier this morning, and I'm afraid to call him back because I don't know what he wants me to change, but it can't be small. Right. But the result of all this was an exhibit told in the first person that uses Cheyenne and Arapaho language. Not only can you hear these section panels, so if you come to the exhibition, there's 5 sections, each one of them is introduced. One of these tall panels that's actually taller than I am. But it's read in Cheyenne and in Arapaho in Spanish, actually. And you can use your phone to grab the QR code, listen to that. And I can't tell you the number of tribal elders who started crying to hear their language spoken at moments. It was really powerful. Of course, that got me. But we are just really proud and really honored that the Cheyenne and Arapaho allowed us to tell this story in their voice. You know, that they brought their voice to Denver in this way. And as you can see, you know, it's narrated, we are the Arapaho. We are some of Colorado's original gatekeepers. We, not they. It's not a museum. It is us, the Arapaho. And the same for the Cheyenne. And it's really innovative, and it's something that we've been doing for a long time. It's something that my colleagues Shannon and Liz piloted with our revamp of the Indian Museum in Montrose, and then the subsequent Written on the Land exhibition at the History Colorado Center, also told from the first person perspective, from the Ute perspective. And it's only possible by this deep consultation process and in partnership, but really when we take our lead from the tribes and let them tell us what the stories are, how to tell them. So I'll end here. This is a photograph of us in Oklahoma. This is Shannon, it's me and my friend Celia. She was our lead designer. Glennis, our NAGPRA representative, and James Peterson was our unbelievable curator of artifacts who has since retired, gone off the grid, which is good for him. He was the photographer. Fred Mosquito, who many of you know here, Chester Whiteman, and Karen the Little Coyote. And we're standing in front of what used to be an Indian industrial school, and it's sort of an abandoned wreck near the town of believe Canton, Oklahoma, which is about as far from the middle of nowhere, or as close to the middle of nowhere as you could ever get. But a powerful place. And, you know, we're all there smiling and we're all there happy to be with each other because at the end of the day, these are our friends. You know, we spent a lot of time driving around rural places in their trucks, eating at the same truck stop. I gathered a couple of Cheyenne names. One of them is raspberry vinaigrette because I ordered, thank God I found a salad after 4 days at McDonald's. It was very welcome change. And they gave me, it's a vat of raspberry vinaigrette to go with my spinach. And that's all it was. And I was so grateful to find it. My other Southern Cheyenne name is Him Not Know. Which is just way more appropriate than you even so. And then there's a few that are not appropriate for this. They're along the same lines. But we're just so lucky and grateful to have these people and we're so grateful for their patience and their understanding and their willingness to explain things to Him Not Know. And their willingness to share these stories because, you know, as difficult as they are for us to hear, you know, 160 almost years on the massacre, or even harder to hear when it's about your great grandmother. And they're harder to tell to strangers than you. And so that's the takeaway, I think, is that this is living history. It's family history. It's not an event from the past, especially for this thing. So that's my talk. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to stick around for a little while. And feel free to reach out. I think I'm pretty easy to find on the internet, but Kate has my contact information as well. So free to share. Thank you.
I'll start off with a question. I didn't hear the A word as in archaeology. So
No,
is there-
did you?
yeah.
Well, I'm a historian and I'm in a room full of archaeologists.
Well, there's historical archaeologists,
That's true.
my cousins.
Right. Well, so archaeology is really fraught with the Sand Creek Massacre, as I'm sure everybody here knows. The process of discovering Sand Creek, finding the Sand Creek Massacre, finding the Sand Creek site. It's politics, it's science, it's oral tradition, it's historical research, but mostly it's politics. And I don't know exactly, what is your question?
Oh, well, so this was historians working with Native Americans. Were any archaeologists who've been in the site part of this process?
The short answer is sort of. We were really lucky to have Alexa Roberts, who was the first superintendent of the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site on our scholarly advisory committee. She is a cultural anthropologist, which is not quite the same thing, but is very closely connected to the archaeological work that was done to find the site. The archaeology around Sand Creek is fraught, not only because of the human remains and the deep spiritual nature of, you know, what happens in the Cheyenne and Arapaho belief systems. So we're talking about two totally separate tribes here, right? These are two totally different cultures. They don't share a single word. They don't share a single religious practice, belief. Two different tribes. So, but for both of them, you know, dying and not receiving the proper burial rites, it has implications for not just the person who is dead and didn't receive the rites, but their family and their tribe and their band. And that doesn't go. Those stories are handed down, and that's part of the generation. When the site was being discovered, the National Park Service, you know, being a very bureaucratic federal agency, said we have very strict requirements over, you know, around what we can say is a national park site. We need to have documented physical evidence that this is where the massacre occurred before we can do anything. And so that was the archaeological work that was done. And it was really groundbreaking at the time. They went to where oral histories and historical studies had said the the massacre, what happened, sure enough, they found shell fragments, army, everything that you would expect to find from the camp, including the piles of Cheyenne and Arapaho food and cookware and teepee fragments that the troops burned so that the tribes couldn't come back and get their stuff. But, of course, there's an inherent tension oftentimes between archaeology, what that tells us, and probably oral history, what that tells us. And unfortunately, what ended up happening as part of that process was that the white landowners at the time, who have made an unbelievable turn in terms of their attitude towards these tribes. But at the time, extremely racist beliefs about Native peoples prohibited them. And they ended up saying, we only believe the documentary evidence of what's coming out of the ground. That is the real truth, not what the tribal elders are saying. And so depending on whose belief system you were kind of siding with, ended up being a litmus test for your seriousness, again, your beliefs about what happened at Sand Creek. And it took a combination of historical research in archives in DC in the NMAI and Smithsonian collections, physical archaeology of what was recovered at the site, and geology, actually, to really reconcile all these things. And what ended up being the biggest problem was that the tribal oral histories, which correct, said that the massacre happened at the Big Bend, the Big Sandy Creek, near Fort Lyon. Should be pretty easy to find, right? Big Bend, there it is on the map. Here's the archaeology, it's saying this stuff. That's where the site is. Well, the oral history said it's further up the river. And it took the geologists taking a look at the floodplain to understand that in the 160 years since the Sand Creek Massacre, the river shifted, right? It's hundreds of yards away from where it used to be. And once that kind of came to light, I think it gave everybody this excuse to be like, oh, we all should have thought of that. Of course, all this. And the other thing that happened was the archaeologists really started taking seriously the tribal accounts, which said that this was a running battle. It wasn't just a stationary slaughter, and that you will find musket balls and clothing fragments and human remains all the way up the creek, because people fled, and most of them fled north along Big Sandy Creek back towards their bones, which were further, closer to the Front Range. And it turned out that the archaeology bore them. And so today there's very little controversy over the actual site, even though 10, 15 years ago, it was enough of a question that the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site almost wasn't created.
Thanks.
Did I get it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you speak a little bit on the kind of the history afterwards and, the federal government, declaring it a massacre?
Yeah.
Was there any thought then of reparations or anything, or what was the result of this?
Yeah. It is a really unique story in terms, in the history of relationships between Native tribes and the US government. So immediately after the Sand Creek Massacre, I'm talking hours, John Shivington, the commander of the troops that attacked the camp, hopped a stagecoach to leg it back to Denver. He was the hero of the Battle of Glory of the Past. He was known as the Fighting Parson, and he was a hero in Colorado, and particularly in Denver. And he saw his military campaigns as stepping stone to national political prominence. He was going to be Colorado's first senator. He wrote long, glowing accounts of his men's heroism in action, wildly embellished accounts of how many of his troops were killed by the savages at Sand Creek. And, it makes for some pretty entertaining reading, but it's hopeful. There's almost no truth in this. And Shivington knew that he was attacking a camp of peaceful people. He set scouts, or he set pickets around Fort Lyon before the massacre to ensure that no one could leave and mourn these folks because he knew that they would flee. But he also knew that there's almost no risk in attacking them. And he wanted to punish the Cheyenne and Arapaho people for what he saw as disobedience to the US government. But his motives were almost certainly all sort of based in his future plans. And as you know, a couple days after Shivington arrived in Denver, the rest of the companies arrived, and there was this gruesome parade of horrific atrocities. But brave, very brave men, including Silas Sewell and Joseph Kramer, immediately said, Shivington is lying. This was an unprovoked attack on unarmed people. Sewell didn't allow his men to fire on the people camped there because he knew what it was, which was the wholesale slaughter of defenseless people. And he wrote a letter to his commander, the commander of Fort Lyon, Ned Wynkoop. His name might be familiar to beer fans of Denver. And Wynkoop was in the midst of almost being court-martialed for feeding the people in the Cheyenne and Arapaho, which is what John Evans had directed him to do. So these letters start filtering out, and accounts, and in that way, accounts of Sand Creek were contested almost from the very moment that it happened. The military got wind of what happened at Sand Creek. They got wind of these letters that Sewell had been writing and that were corroborated by many of the men who were at Sand Creek. And I think this is the most fascinating part of the entire story of the aftermath. In January and February and March 1865, right? This is before Gettysburg, so this is the height of the Civil War. U.S. Congress and the U.S. military, which was slightly preoccupied with some other things going on, paused all their business to investigate the Sand Creek Massacre. 2 congressional investigations and a military investigation all concluded that this was, quote, a foul and dastardly massacre. And they condemned Shivington and John Evans for their roles for Evans in setting the stage by essentially making it legal to hunt Native peoples in Colorado, which, by the way, was legal until last year when Polis rescinded that order, and condemned Shivington for conducting this massacre, which was absolutely not in keeping with military's expectations of its commanders. So, there was very little doubt in the minds of serious people for 160 years as to whether or not this was a massacre. It was called a battle later on as sort of the process of whitewashing and the, just the need for American myth making in the American West to absolve itself of these crimes. And, like I said before, I think the trauma of the massacre and just the horribleness of its truths has prevented it from being something people want to talk about, and that includes in tribal communities. So a lot of this stuff has been really well known for 160 years to historians. That these letters are a matter of public record for that entire time. But it's really just, in the last few years that people actually take a look at it. But
Yeah, did that happen in other subsequent massacres and other?
it's really unprecedented. I think too, there's not very many massacres that happened on this scale to non-combatants, and I think that's really one of the things that makes the Sand Creek story so horrifying.
And was there regular army involved, or is it almost all?
Yeah, there was, Christian might help me out here. There was a company of regular United States cavalry led by Captain Silas Sewell and his underlings. They were commissioned Civil War soldiers, and they had been serving since 1861. But the 100 Days volunteers, the ones that were specifically raised by John Evans to attack Native peoples on the plains, they were the ragtag militia, and they were coming from here. And they knew the people they were attacking personally. They went looking for Chief Lieutenant.
And you mean from here, you mean literally both?
Literally from
Yeah.
Boulder.
Like, down the road.
Yeah, for Chief. And I think, one of the things I'm very interested in Evans, and he's certainly no hero and doesn't deserve to have a 14 named after him. But I have just the tiniest little bit of sympathy for him because he was the victim of bad intel. He should have known it, right? I guess victim. But he legitimately thought that there was a large force of Cheyenne and Lakota who were primed to come and burn down Denver and kill all of the settlers there. From the Lakota and Cheyenne perspective, they were defending their homes from invading colonizers who brought diseases and guns and people to try to kill them. And so Evans created this company of militia volunteers specifically to defend Denver from this attack. And paranoia was so high and so rampant in Denver, and boosters and anti-Indian agitators like William Byers had so whipped up this climate of fear that when the rumors of the Lakota and Cheyenne attack came into Denver, they took all the women and children, hold them up in the city and county building and in the mint, burned down the staircases that led to those places, and had armed bands of men patrolling the streets of Denver to thwart this attack from the Cheyenne and Lakota that never happened. The Cheyenne and Lakota were hundreds of miles away in the Dakotas and Montana at the time. So, I think it just goes to show the degree to which the fear-mongering and anti-Indian attitudes had poisoned the relationship, that Evans felt not only that he had to raise this company, but also that he had to make it legal to hunt. And I mean, if you look at the order, that's literally what it is. And I'll tell another story. Same representative I told you about, his niece's birthday party. He was telling me, he was at the descendants, Paul said, okay, yeah, you can't hunt Native people in Colorado. It's 2021. We got to get past that. Anyway, he's talking about this, and I was like, well, what did you feel at the time when you're watching that sign? And he just starts laughing uncontrollably, and he's like, oh, I didn't know all this time I've been coming to Colorado for 60 years, and I could have just gotten hunted down in Walmart, and they could have taken my wallet. It's like, Gail, that's not funny, but you need humor at some point.
Got a question from online.
Sure.
When did you, as a Boulder native, first learn about Sand Creek?
I have been wondering that myself for the last 3 years. I must have learned about it in 4th grade, as part of the history curriculum, and it's been in the books, as a footnote, right? Cheyenne and Arapaho people lived here. And then something happened, and it's called Sand Creek. I remember specifically learning about Cheyenne and Arapaho people and sort of their life ways and their life movements as a junior ranger from Open Space and Mountain Parks, one of our sort of education moments that we got to have. And I remember standing in Settlers Park looking out at the plains thinking, I wonder what this would have been like when it was no buildings here. And that was my first inkling that there was something bigger. There's a bigger story, right? That there's a question. Why aren't they here anymore? And it was never satisfactorily answered. So the first time I can really remember about learning about Sand Creek specifically was in as an undergraduate at St. Boulder. Took a Native North American history class. And I mean, this is a niche class. There were maybe 40 people in this class. And I'm pretty sure it was the only class on campus that talked about Sand Creek. So it's a topic that was pretty easy to Google, but pretty hard to really dive into. If you didn't already know what you're looking
To follow up with another letter from the alphabet B, as in Ben Nighthorse Campbell, is he talked about in the new exhibition?
Yeah, a little bit. And our representatives asked us to include some information about how the historic site was formed. And of course, Senator Nighthorse Campbell is Northern Cheyenne, and he played an incredibly important role in establishing the site. And the story goes that former state historian David Hollis had been doing some work with some local community members around historic preservation of old documents, and he ran across a U.S. military scribe, essentially a copyist, had transcribed the Silas Sewell's and Joseph Kramer's accounts of the Sand Creek Massacre as written to Ed Lincoln. These accounts were not, they had been preserved as part of the congressional record, as part of these investigations, but the letters have been lost. And the original letters are long gone, but these scribes' accounts survived in the trunk in the attic of a woman named Linda Raybeck. And the story is that David Hollis, on the eve of the Senate floor debate that would decide the fate of the Sand Creek Massacre site, found these in the trunk, and he raced to DC with them in a briefcase, handed them to Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who read them out on the Senate floor, and that's what turned the tide in terms of the vote. Personally, I think they didn't do where the letters were all along. This is the story. It's a good story, but I think it's a story. Either way, the letters did turn the tide, and Senator Nighthorse Campbell was, instrumental in creating this, and in bringing attention to Sand Creek and bringing President Colorado to it. So, yeah.
Do you know if there are some large projects to gather the they call them historical stories
Oral
from
histories?
oral histories from maybe?
Yeah. It goes in fits and starts. So Alexa Roberts, who is the cultural anthropologist, cousin to archaeology, she collected better part of 20 oral histories in the 90s and early 2000s as part of creating the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, from descendants of the victims. And almost all those people, except for Dr. Little Bear and a few others, have since passed on because they were in their 80s at the time. And since then, to my knowledge, there's not been a lot of work to collect those stories. We collected some on video as part of this exhibition, and they're available in Denver, History, Colorado. The truth is that it is really difficult to get people to talk about it. It is too painful for some. Again, for some, it's just don't talk about it. It's past. It's too painful. It's cursed. We don't talk about that. And it's a big lift, emotionally. So, yeah, I think what needs to happen is somebody, well, not me, but probably needs to find a grant and needs to work in partnerships with these tribes to observe the stories. But we not to toot our own horn, do that with Sand Creek, but we are one of the few public institutions that has used these as the basis for public learning. These oral histories collected in the 2000s have not been publicly available ever. You can listen to them in the exhibit. They're going to be available at the Sand Creek site. And the Sand Creek Massacre Foundation, which is the fundraising arm of the Sand Creek National Historic Site, most parks have them. They have created an awesome oral history recording studio down in Eads at the site. Getting anyone to go there means taking them to Eads, which you never do if you don't have to, but tough, yeah.
Do you see this exhibit as a correction of the somewhat sensationalized representations of Sand Creek in the popular white culture? I'm thinking of like Centennial,
Right.
fictionalized it, and also there was a movie back in the 70s, Soldier Blue.
Oh, yeah. Corrective might not be the word. We see this as sort of the next iteration of efforts to commemorate and educate. It really started with the healing run that was begun by Laird Komatsiba and Otto Braided Hair and a number of the representatives back in the 90s. And then, that was followed on by the historic site and taking the Apology in 2014. So I think this is sort of more of an educational thing. And, in terms of sensationalization, like I said, the story of Sand Creek has been contested, since it happened. It's not in the cultural memory enough for this to be a corrective, I guess I would say. And, to the like, so I'm in my 30s. I had never heard of Soldier Blue or any of that until I started working on this project. And I think many people in my generation would look at you and be like, what? What is this? Sand Creek? But first of all, they don't know about it. But second of all, I think for them, they've grown up in a world that's a little more honest about what happened. And I think the other thing to remember here is that largely this exhibit preaches to the choir. If you're someone who has sympathetic views towards Native peoples and understands the implications of the word conquest, you're much more likely to come and expose yourself to this kind of learning than you are if you happen to think that Sand Creek was justified because of the violence that Native people did against, the colonizers and the invaders. And we hear from those people; they're out there. It's a lot of whataboutism, and I think for really well-educated folks who have the privilege of lots of diverse viewpoints, it's unthinkable. How would you think that? For someone who grew up in Lamar and for whom your high school mascot is the Savage, that cultural understanding is different. So, I think to say it's a corrective would be way overstating history, Colorado's reach and influence, but also, I think I just don't. Yeah, I just don't think that the other point of view, right, that this is a glory foul, is prevalent anymore. Just don't hear. Yeah.
Is that, do you think that's accurate for the local communities around Eads too? Like, has that changed? You're discussing the landowners or previous landowners earlier, and how they've really reconciled their understanding of the oral histories.
Well, it's person to person, but I will say, a large part of, and if you haven't read Ari Kelman's book, Displaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek, it is by far the best account of Sand Creek Massacre, and he is a brilliant genius, and one of those people who I get in the same room with and just, in grad school, you put these authors on a pedestal, and then you meet them, and they're like, no, I'm just a human who wrote a book, but you still idolize it. Anyway, so in that book, he really talks about the community's attempts and in the process of this community coming to grips with the massacre, its legacy, and frankly the historic site. Now, National Park Service, big federal bureaucratic institution. Eads, Colorado, tiny town, deeply skeptical of the federal government, right? Deeply insular and not particularly sympathetic to the view that, America's ever done anything wrong. It's the truth. So it was a big hurdle to get over, and it was two big hurdles. And frankly, from what I've heard, I think the bigger hurdle was not, there's Indians coming to Eads all of a sudden. It was the federal government's going to be here in a big way. And by big way, we mean like 7 points. It's real, and so there was a lot of skepticism, but I think, if you have been to Eads, that the biggest business in town is the gas station where the subway is and the golf course, which inexplicably exists on the plains. But there's literally nothing else there. Like if you don't need a subway, you got to drive to Lamar. Because there's nothing else there. And what the argument was at the time that I think is really borne out is this is good. This is going to create jobs. It's going to be tourism, it's going to mean beautiful hotels, it's gonna be people coming to town every year on the anniversary of the site. And I think, people kind of got over the whole, I don't know about these other people coming in, they got over that othering. And they got over their fear of the federal government to, well, let's lift the National Park Service. And in fact, the current superintendent of the National Park site, Janet Frederick, grew up in Eads. I mean, she's been golfing there since she was a kid. So as with everything, time and exposure and just understanding that there's humans and it's not just the feds, the Indians, right? It's softened a lot of that. Not entirely, not all the way. I mean, you still have to drive through the town of Shittington to get to the park site. Horrible, but that's just how it is, But still Eastern Colorado, it's decent. One last funny story, and then I'll get to Kate. We were in Lamar, staying in Lamar, having one of our consultations at the rec center that doubles as the high school gymnasium. The day after they had been forced to change the name, they lost the lawsuit, and had to change the name of their high school mascot from the Savages to, I think wanted to call it the Savage Thunder, which they're like. So now I think they're just the Lamar Thunder. But the mascot, if you haven't seen it, was a white guy dressed in a headdress, supposed to be an Indian, look white, shirtless and muscle. Right? We go into this local restaurant, still one of the best Mexican restaurants I've ever been to, in Lamar. And we see, they had a little banner in there that said, once a savage, always a savage. And I had the mascot. And I'm there with Otto braided hair, who is, he's one of our representatives from the Northern Cheyenne. Like, Otto, look at that. How did they get my picture? People, right? Okay.
Yeah, I had questions about the exhibit. How does the approach that History Colorado took with this exhibit differ from the approach, say, that the Park Service has had? I mean, either historically, but like with their contemporary exhibits as well.
Yeah. We went to school on the Alexa Roberts model of consultation, which is to say, she became the park director by taking her lead entirely from the tribes. Nothing about the tribes without the tribes. Deep consultation. There is no detail too small to consult on. Call as much as you can. Bring them to Eads. Get the money. Fund it. They ask for it. Make it happen. The word no really didn't start coming out of our mouths until very close to the end of the exhibit creation process, when it was just, if you want this to open by November 18th, then we cannot accommodate this particular request. And it wasn't a no, it was, if you want this, then this can't happen. If you want this, this is how this can happen. And it was a lot of conflict. So we really learned from the Park Service. And by the Park Service, I mean the people who created the National Historic Site and run it now. I don't think the National Park Service is really the model you want to use for consultation at all, in all instances. But they probably are one of these federal level institutions that has the most contact with Native people. I mean, maybe aside from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they are the ones that have the most interaction with these tribes.
So it's not a check the box approach with them,
It is a deep,
unlike a lot of federal.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that, I think the check the box approach is what doomed many projects, right? I mean, and I've seen this happen. DU is looking to create a mountain campus. Don't exactly know where, but it's, historic Arapaho land. And yeah, that was my reaction. Why?
I went there and I'm like, why?
The answer is out-of-state kids.
Yeah, they have a campus. I forget it's a lake south of like Idaho Springs.
Yeah.
Geography
exactly.
department.
Yeah, so it's, Arapaho land, and they did a whole survey to find out, hey, are we gonna dig up anybody? No, as it turns out, but, so they bring the Arapaho representatives down, they bring in their architect, and they bring out the model, and they're like, this is what we're gonna do. Do you approve? The Arapaho were like, no, and this is not what you're gonna do, and what the hell? So, it's not even, I mean, yeah, check the box, but I mean, of course, we're dealing with people who have been working with federal government for their entire lives. They are incredibly savvy political operators. And they know how to make bureaucrats twist in the wind, and they're really good at it, and it makes you feel really uncomfortable. But the main thing is, you don't present something to them and ask them to prove it. You let them tell you what to do. And then you tell them, okay, well, this is one of the problems that I see, my professional capacity, my professional opinion. This could be a problem for these reasons. And then you go from there. You find consensus. So, I mean, it is about consensus. And frankly, when you're dealing with tribes, I didn't get to your question about reparation. I should have. Circle back to that because it has bearing on this consensus issue. The Treaty of Little Arkansas, 1860 something. I'm not going to put a date on it. It's a terrible story, but it's after the Sand Creek Massacre, 1865, 1868, somewhere in there. It's essentially a reparations treaty, and in it, it says the U.S. government owes reparations to the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, and it is up to the discretion of the Secretary of the Interior for how to do that and how to make it happen. Those reparations were only paid to like 2 families, and it's because two Cheyenne women were married into white families. They married white American men. So white American men were the beneficiaries of these reparations. They got some paid. Powers family. It's not the Betts. Maybe it was the Betts. Anyway, the rest of the reparations were never paid. But if you parse that, federal government owes the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes reparations. And it's up to the Secretary of the Interior to make that happen, right? In whatever capacity they say. That's really specific. And a lot has happened since 1860, or whatever it was, that has made that super complicated. So in the last time we saw the tribes out at the site was for the expansion. They nearly doubled the size of the park back in September. And there was a meeting between representatives from the 3 tribal nations, elders, dignitaries there. And it was only between them and the Secretary of the Interior and John Hickenlooper and Mike Bennett, right? You would think, right, this is going to be the time, right? We're going to get some attention. They're going to get some reparations. Discussion is happening. Apparently, I wasn't in the room where it happened. I was listening to the Hamilton soundtrack on the way up here. The discussion blew up. Rage. People left out. I watched people storm out, stomp out of that room. Because at the very end of the meeting, one of the Southern Cheyenne delegates said, Northern tribes weren't there. This treaty says Southern tribes. Well, we know that descendants of the massacre's victims and survivors live with both of the tribes. So it doesn't really matter that it only says Southern tribes, but it could. And the politics of this are so intractable that they, from my perspective, just totally lost this once in a generation opportunity. They're in a room with Colorado senators and the Secretary of the Interior, the first Native person to be a cabinet secretary. There's never been a better time, and self-interest and political infighting take the opportunity. And that happens so often. It happens so much with this exhibit. Because they just have never had control over their own lives, in a meaningful way, or of this story in a meaningful way. And there's a lot of disagreement over who gets to tell it and who has the authority to be a storyteller and, to control the narrative. And it's tragic, but also kind of predictable. Frankly, I'm really just speaking frankly here. From my point of view, it's a missed opportunity, but I'm not Cheyenne. I'm not Arapaho. I'm not someone who's lived with this trauma my entire life. I'm not someone who has lived in poverty. Right? I grew up in Boulder. My dad's a doctor. immensely privileged. So I've never had to fight for my tiny slice of reparations. So my perspective is absolutely not one. Take it with an entire steak shaker full of salt. But this is just what I saw.
How long is the exhibit going to be open? Is it considered permanent?
We don't have permanent exhibits in History Colorado, and particularly this one, you know, we are in continual partnership with these tribes, and we have changed 2 or 3 things in the exhibit since it opened at the request of the tribes, just because, you know, got a word wrong, or we used the wrong orthography, or, you know, whatever the thing was. But we consider it a core offering of our educational mission. So as far as anything is around, this is mission.
So there's commitment from History Colorado to keep this material going and to keep the relationship going.
Absolutely. Yeah, so for example, right now, wearing my publications director hat, we are currently consulting on working on a podcast that uses the histories and new recordings that we've made with these representatives. It's part of our Lost Highways series. If you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend. Our brand new season launched 2 weeks ago. Lost Highways, Dispatches from the Shadows. I didn't pick the title, but it's still a good podcast.
We'll link it in the newsletter.
Yeah, sign up for the weekly digest.
Yeah.
Also comes from my department. And the Colorado Magazine will have, we'll be reprinting a number of Sand Creek related articles over the next year. But yeah, we're committed to this. We ran out of NEH funds for the exhibition, but we are applying for more grant funding. We want to create a program that brings Cheyenne and Arapaho youth from the reservations to Colorado to do different things. I've been having some really preliminary conversations with the Museum of Boulder over how History Colorado can help with the Chambers initiative. Yeah, we're running.
I think there's a new sister city with Wind River Reservation and Longmont.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And they have the Northern Arapaho, just by virtue of being the closest tribe, have deep connections to tons of different places in Colorado, particularly Strasburg High School and Arapaho High School. 2 high schools that have been able to continue using the mascots, which are Strasburg, I can't remember, but the Arapaho is like, that's their mascot. And it's because they have had the consultations, they have created the partnerships. Eugene Snowball Ridgely painted the mascot for Strasburg High School, you know, and it's depicts the Arapaho people as they want to be depicted using their culturally relevant materials, you know, and we are so fortunate that this exhibit it contains so much rich information that I was so fortunate to learn about Arapaho people and culture. And it talks about, you know, the 4 Hills of Life, which is the core of what it means to be an Arapaho person, and explains this from their perspective on the wall in the museum. I mean, this has just never been done. So, you know, the partnerships I think are really just starting, and frankly, it all comes from money and the willingness to understand that, yeah, we're going to pay for them to come down and stay in a hotel and have a consultation, but that also means they're going to be in Denver so they can see their doctor. And we're paying for the gas for them to be able to come down and see the doctor. Like, it's transactional and not in a gross way, but in a way that is culturally relevant. And that's been the story of relationships between U.S. governments and Native tribes since 1690.